Harold, I'll give you 800 on trade. That machine is a liability you don't need. The laughter that followed came from Rick Voss's service tech, standing in the doorway with his phone in one hand. A quick exhale through the nose, head shaking, the kind of laugh that costs nothing because it's aimed at someone who isn't going to fight back. The whole shed went quiet except for the drip of oil off a socket wrench hitting the floor. Harold Meeks rolled out from under the International Harvester 856 on a mechanic's creeper, wiped his hands on a red shop rag, and looked up at Rick from the floor. He was 71 years old, lean and deliberate, wearing insulated coveralls and safety glasses pushed up on his forehead. The engine of the 856 was exposed, the hood off, both valve covers removed, a work light clipped to the firewall. He had been under it for 2 hours. He looked at Rick. He said, "She's not for trade." Rick Voss shook his head slowly. "We don't stock parts for the 856 anymore, Harold. When something goes, you're on your own." He said this with genuine concern, which was the thing about Rick. His contempt was always dressed up as care. Harold sat up on the creeper. "Already got them. Everyone. Made a list in '09. Rick looked at the engine bay. He looked at the tool cart. He looked at Harold on the floor. He said, "Nobody runs old iron in a real operation, Harold. Not anymore." Then he turned and walked back to his truck. Harold watched him go. He did not argue. He wiped his hands on the rag and went back under the tractor. But what Rick Voss didn't know, and had genuinely never thought to ask about, was that Harold Meeks had spent 40 years as a mechanical engineer at a diesel manufacturing plant in Des Moines, and that he had rebuilt that 856 to factory specification over 3 consecutive winters. Every bearing, every seal, the hydraulic pump, the fuel system, the injectors, all of it documented on 3 spiral-bound pages that were currently sitting on the workbench, and there was no telematics module. None. Do you know what that means when the whole county's guidance system goes dark on a June morning? But before we get to that, let's go back to the winter of 1969 and a father's first payment on a machine he intended to last. The 856 had come to the Meeks farm in November of that year. Harold was 14. His father, Calvin, had driven to the dealership in Ames and written a check for a figure that represented about 2 years of the farm's free cash. And he had driven the tractor home on the county road 16 miles, second gear most of the way. The diesel, steady and cold weather, strong. Harold rode in the truck behind him. He watched the tractor's red hood in the truck's headlights and thought about how big it was and how his father sat on it like a man who owned the thing. Not just physically, but in the way of someone who understood it. Calvin Meeks ran that 856 for 18 years. He farmed with it, moved grain with it, pulled stuck equipment out of mud with it, bush-hogged the field roads, moved round bales, dragged tile through the South 40. In 1987, a front axle bearing failed, and the cost of the repair, at that point, with a machine 18 years old, didn't pencil against the value of an upgrade. Calvin put the 856 in the machine shed. He moved to a newer utility tractor. He did not throw the 856 away, because Calvin Meeks did not throw things away. But he left it in the corner of the shed under a canvas tarp with the intention of coming back to it. He never quite got to it. Harold came back to the farm in 2017, when his father turned 91, and the corn wasn't getting planted on time, and the hired man had quit. Harold had spent 40 years at a plant in Des Moines that manufactured diesel injection systems for commercial truck engines. He knew diesel systems the way some people know their own kitchens, at the level of reflex, at the level of understanding what every sound means and what every number represents. He retired early to come back to the farm. And when he walked into the machine shed and pulled the top off the 856, he stood in front of it for a long time. Then he made a list. He walked the tractor. He couldn't run it. It wouldn't start. And he opened every access point and inspected every system and wrote down what was worn, what was failed, what was marginal, and what was fine. The list was 4 pages long. He priced the parts at 2 suppliers. He did the math. He decided to start the rebuild the following November, when the row crop work was done. He finished in February of his 3rd winter, working in insulated coveralls in an unheated shed in temperatures that dropped to single digits. He torqued every fastener to spec. He had the hydraulic pump rebuilt at a machine shop in Nevada, Iowa. The injectors were Riemann units from a supplier in Minnesota who specialized in pre-emissions diesel. The fuel system was cleaned and resealed from the tank forward. Every bearing was new. Every seal was new. He put a new battery in it and fresh diesel and cranked it for the first time on a February morning. And it started on the 3rd revolution. And he sat in the cab and let it warm up for 20 minutes and listened to it. He had a rebuild log, 3 spiral-bound pages, his handwriting, every part listed by spec number, and the date it was installed. The log was on a nail by the shed door. He put it there so he'd see it when he walked in. Rick Voss read the first page of the rebuild log on his 2nd visit to the shed and set it down without picking it up. He had come with a printed trade-in proposal. Dealer letterhead, $800 for the 856, applied toward a late model utility tractor with GPS guidance, telematic support, auto steer, parts availability through 2035. He walked Harold through the benefits the way a man walks through a prepared speech. At 9:15 a.m., Harold asked, "When the guidance system fails in a wet ground event, what's the diagnostic turnaround?" Rick said the system had 99.2% uptime. Harold said, "That means it fails." Rick said, "Harold, that's not how you use that statistic." Harold said, "I know what that number means. I wrote uptime specs for 20 years. Rick folded the proposal. He said nobody ran old iron in a real operation. He had been saying this for 3 years. He was starting to hear it as true. At 6:52 a.m. on June 14th, a flash flood crossed 3 county roads in Boone County, and the telematics node that managed the GPS guidance and remote diagnostics on 3 late model tractors across 2 neighboring farms went dark. All 3 tractors at the same time. The storm had overwhelmed the cellular relay that the guidance system used for remote authentication, and without a confirmed connection to the service network, the tractor's guidance computers had locked out the hydraulic drive systems as a safety precaution. 3 expensive, late model machines, all of them sitting still. Dale Hoffman called Harold at 7:03 a.m. Harold was in the kitchen with coffee. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of June rain that ran brown in the field road ditches and collected in the low corners of every field in the county. He looked out the window. "How much hay you got down?" Harold said. Dale said, 400 acres across 3 of us. Mine's all cut. Jim's is raked. Terry's is cut and half raked. All of it going to rot if we don't move it today. Harold said, "I'll be there in 6 minutes." He pulled his boots on, drove the 856 out of the shed in the rain, and was at Dale Hoffman's field by 7:09. He backed up to the Baller at 7:11, hooked up in 3 minutes, and started the first pass at 7:14. It was not complicated. The 856 had no GPS guidance. It had no telematics module. It had no remote authentication requirement. It had a rebuilt hydraulic system with new seals and a rebuilt pump core, a magneto-ignition system that did not care about cellular signal, and a diesel engine running at factory specification. It started when Harold turned the key. It ran when Harold put it in gear. It did not stop. Rick Voss's service tech, a young man named Aaron, 26 years old, 3 years out of technical school, had arrived at Dale's farm by 8:30. He had his diagnostic tablet. He connected to the tractor's OBD port and ran the diagnostic protocol. The fault code pointed to the telematics authentication failure. He called the dealer's remote support line. They told him the node was down region-wide. They told him it would take 4 to 6 hours for the system engineers to restore service. They told him to stay on site. Aaron called Rick at 9:15. Rick said, "Stay on site." At that moment, Harold's 856 was on its 4th pass of Dale's field, working at a pace calibrated by Harold's judgment rather than by a GPS wayline, which meant it was actually slightly faster because Harold knew the field and didn't need the headland overlap, the guidance system built in for positioning accuracy. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The bale count was ahead of schedule. You know this kind of person. You've seen this kind of thing. The one who built something everyone else dismissed, who maintained it with care when there was no audience, who put the documentation on a nail by the door, not for anyone else but because it was the right way to do it. The machine that the dealer called a liability, humming across a rain-soaked field while 3 modern machines sat dark and silent in their rows. If you've subscribed yet, now's a good time. More of these stories are on the way. By noon, Harold had moved to Jim Kepler's field, 2 miles north. By 2 o'clock, he was at Terry Walsh's operation on the south side of the county. Rick Voss arrived at the county road at 3 o'clock with his service truck, hoping to get the remote node restored and the tractors running. His service truck had a flat rear tire before he reached Dale's farm. A nail in the road from a grain wagon. The kind of thing that happens on busy harvest days. He was on the shoulder of the county road with a flat tire when the 856 made its 9th pass on Terry Walsh's field in the late afternoon light. He could see it from the road. He did not walk into the field. He stood by the truck and watched. At 5:44 p.m., when the 856's headlights came on in the dusk, Harold had been running since 7:14. That morning, 10.5 hours, no stops except for fuel at hour 6. A woman named Karen Detweiler was at the county road with a camera. She wrote for a regional agricultural magazine, Iowa Roots and Fields, and she had been in Boone County for a different story. A profile of a young farmer's hoop house operation, and had heard about the situation at the co-op. She drove to the county road and parked. She watched the 856 make 2 passes. Then she raised the camera. The photograph she took at 5:44 p.m. showed the 856 moving through the dusk, the headlights on, Harold's silhouette visible through the Rain Street cab window. And in the background, slightly out of focus, 3 modern tractors standing dark in the field entry. Parked, silent, engines off. The caption she wrote was, June 14th, only working machine on 3 Boone County farms, hour 22. That wasn't quite right. It was hour 10 and a half at that point. But the photograph ran in the August issue, and by that time, Harold had in fact run 22 hours total across the 3 operations by the time the last bale dropped at 5:08 a.m. on the 15th. 19 hours after Aaron called Rick about the telematics failure, the remote node was restored. The 3 tractors rebooted. The guidance systems came back online. The tractors started. Rick's service tech drove to each farm, confirmed the systems were operational, and filed the service reports. The total service cost across 3 operations was $6,200. Harold charged his neighbors nothing. He drove the 856 back to his shed at 6:15 a.m. on June 15th. He shut it off. He climbed down from the cab and walked around the tractor the way he always walked around it after a long run, checking for anything that needed attention, looking at the hitch, feeling the temperature of the transmission case with the back of his hand. Everything was correct. Everything was within spec. He went inside and made coffee. At hour 19 of the run, Rick Voss had crossed the field to where Harold was making a turn at the north end. Harold had idled down. Rick stood beside the tractor in the rain, the service truck still stuck on the shoulder behind him, and he did not offer a trade-in. He said, "I didn't know the telematics node covered all 3 farms." Harold said, "I did. I asked your tech about it in 2019. He said it wasn't a failure mode they'd seen." Harold shifted into first. Rick stepped back. Then Harold stopped. He reached into the door pocket and pulled out the rebuild log. 3 pages, spiral-bound, in a plastic sleeve. He kept it in to protect it from the weather. He handed it down to Rick through the cab window. The log was still dry. "That's what no module looks like," Harold said. He drove to the next windrow. Rick stood in the field with the rebuild log in his hands, the rain coming down, the 856's taillights moving away in the dusk. The trade magazine photograph ran in August. The caption said, June 14th, only working machine on 3 Boone County farms, hour 22. Dale Hoffman pinned it to the bulletin board at the county co-op meeting in September. He pinned it without comment. He just took out a tack and put it up. Rick Voss was at that meeting. He read the caption. He set the bulletin board copy back and did not say anything. Harold was not at the meeting. He was at the shed, doing the 856's post-season maintenance. The same list, the same parts cabinet, the same procedure he had followed since the rebuild was complete in 2012. The machine had not failed. He did not expect it to. The following spring, a young farmer named Tyler Graves came to Harold's shed asking about the M. He had seen the magazine photograph at the co-op, and he had asked around until someone gave him Harold's address. He drove over on a Wednesday morning and knocked on the shed door. Harold showed him the rebuild log. He showed him the parts cabinet, the labeled boxes, the second shelf with the spare bearings and injector cores, and the hydraulic seal kit. He explained the documentation system, every part replaced by spec number and date, so that if something failed, he knew exactly when it had gone in and what the service life had been. Tyler said, Rick Voss told me you couldn't get parts for the 856 anymore. Harold looked at the parts cabinet. He said, Suppliers in Minnesota and Iowa. I found them in 2009. Rick doesn't stock for the old lines. That's his business decision. Tyler said, "Can I ask why you kept it, when you could have traded it?" Harold thought about this for a moment. He looked at the 856, the Harvester red paint, worn at the hood corners, the cab window that needed a new gasket on the lower right, the hitch that had moved 40 years of equipment without complaint. He said, "Because I knew what it would do, and I knew what it couldn't do. That's more than I could say for anything with a module." He started the 856. It caught on the first crank. He let it warm up. The diesel sound filled the shed. Steady and even. No faults. No alerts. No authentication requirement. Just a machine running at factory specification. The same as it had run on June 14th. The same as it had run every season since 2012. The same as his father had run it from 1969 to 1987 on ground that Harold now farmed alone. There's a kind of knowledge that does not degrade. A diesel engine rebuilt to spec is a diesel engine rebuilt to spec whether anyone believes in it or not. The 99.2% uptime figure for a telematic system means it fails 0.8% of the time. And 0.8% of the time across enough systems in enough county events is a June morning in Boone County with 400 acres of hay on the ground and a service truck on the shoulder with a flat tire. Harold knew this because he wrote uptime specs for 20 years. He had told Rick Voss that. Rick had not believed him. The rebuild log was still on the nail by the shed door. It was always going to be. Here is the thing about competence that goes unrecognized. It does not need to be loud to be real. It does not need an audience to be correct. The 856's per season performance data did not require Don Kratz's, Rick Voss's approval to be accurate. The rebuild documentation did not become more valid because Karen Detweiler photographed it. It was always valid. Harold knew it was valid. He had put it on the nail by the door for the same reason Ruth Beeler kept the soil log and Gloria Tannen kept the lease copy, because the record is the record and the right morning will come, and you need to have done the work. The right morning was June 14th. Harold was ready. If this story meant something to you, if you know someone who is quietly building something right, while everyone around them tells them it's outdated or unnecessary or a liability, share this with them. Tell them in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe, because the next story involves a lease, a fire-safe box under a kitchen counter, and a clause a woman asked for 26 years ago that nobody remembered but her. Let's slow down at the parts supplier scene, because it matters. In 2011, Harold drove to a warehouse outside Owatonna, Minnesota, that specialized in pre-emissions diesel components and restoration parts for vintage farm equipment. He had found the supplier through an online forum for vintage IH restorers, a thread titled 856 Hydraulic Pump Cores, who still got them. And he had called ahead and confirmed that the supplier had what he needed. He drove 4 hours each way on a Wednesday in February. The warehouse was cold inside. A man named Gene ran the operation. Gene Kalinowski, 64 years old, who had started the business in 1989 after retiring from a Deere component plant and finding that nobody was stocking parts for the machines he had spent his career making. Gene walked Harold through 3 rows of shelving to a section labeled 5-6, O/66/856 hydraulic. He had 2 rebuilt pump cores, 3 new old stock cylinder arms, and a complete seal kit for the 856's lift system. Harold bought both pump cores, 1 ram, and 3 seal kits. Jean said, "You rebuilding one of these?" Harold said, "Third winter." Jean said, "How's it coming?" Harold said, "Better than I expected." Jean said, They always do. People forget these machines were engineered when engineers still went into the field to watch them fail. You can't do that with a satellite." Harold thought about this on the 4-hour drive home. He was not a sentimental man about machinery. He did not rebuild the 856 because it had been his father's exactly. He rebuilt it because the engineering was sound and the machine was restorable, and the economics worked on a 280-acre row crop operation where a grain cart tractor did not need GPS guidance. But Jean's point landed somewhere. The 856 had been designed by people who had watched machines fail in mud and cold and heat and understood what failure looked like from the outside, and who had built accordingly. The telematics module had been designed by people who had watched failure data on a screen and built accordingly. Both approaches had merits. They failed differently. The 856 did not fail on June 14th. The 3 modules did. Harold had known this was a possible failure mode since 2014, when the first GPS-guided tractor came into Boone County through Rick Voss's dealership. He had asked Rick's service tech at the time, a different tech, the previous one, what happened if the remote authentication failed in the field. The tech had said it was a theoretical scenario, that the uptime was extremely high, that real-world failures of that kind were rare. Harold had said, "But they happen?" The tech had said, "Very rarely." Harold had said, "In wet ground events?" The tech had looked at his tablet. "We don't have specific data on wet ground correlation," he had said. "I can ask the service team." Harold had said, "That's all right. I'll keep the 856. That conversation happened in 2014. 5 years before Harold asked Rick Voss's 2019 tech about the no topology. When he confirmed that the same relay covered all 3 farms. And the tech confirmed that a simultaneous node failure had not been seen before. Harold had come home from that 2019 conversation and noted it in a small spiral notebook he kept on the kitchen counter, not the rebuild log. A different notebook, operational observations. He wrote, telematics node confirmed, 3 farms, same relay. Failure mode, cellular relay failure, under weather load. Not seen in county, but physically plausible. IH8, 56, unaffected. He had not told anyone. There was no one who would have understood why he was tracking it. At 6:52 a.m. on June 14th, it mattered. Dale Hoffman was at his kitchen table at 7:03 a.m. looking at a tractor that wouldn't respond to any input. The guidance system locked, the rain hitting the window. He called Harold, because Harold was the kind of man who answered early and knew things, and didn't make you feel bad for asking. He had called Harold before, about a hydraulic cylinder on a baler, about a fuel pump on the grain cart, about a weird noise in the combine header. Harold always answered, and Harold always knew. Harold answered. "How much hay you got down?" Harold said. Dale told him, 400 acres across 3 operations. All of it flat on the ground, rain coming down. The hay going to start fermenting in 12 hours if it wasn't baled and under cover. 3 tractors down. one old machine that was not. Harold said he would be there in 6 minutes. He was there in 6 minutes. The 856's headlights came on at the turn at the north end of Dales Field at 7:14 a.m. The first bale dropped at 7:31. Harold did not call anyone to tell them he was there. He did not post anything. He drove to the end of the row, turned, and drove back. The baler ran clean behind him. The rain came down. At 7:47 a.m., Rick Voss's phone showed 3 simultaneous telematics alerts from neighboring farms. He called Aaron. Aaron was already on his way. Rick told Aaron to call the remote support line from site. Aaron said he would. At that moment, Harold was on his 5th pass of Dales Field. The hay baled clean. The weather broke mid-afternoon. Harold moved between farms on the county road. The 856 on a trailer for the longer moves, unloading and running at each site, staying until the field was done before moving to the next. His neighbors raked ahead of him where they could. Dale had a smaller tractor that wasn't GPS guided, a 2003 utility model, and it ran fine. And where they couldn't, Harold waited at the turn and came back around. He ate lunch in the cab, a thermos of coffee and 2 ham sandwiches that he had made at 6 in the morning before Dale called, not because he knew this was going to be the day, but because he always made his lunch before going to the field. At 3 p.m., Rick Voss arrived at the county road in his service truck. At 3:08 p.m., the rear tire hit the nail. At 3:15 p.m., Rick was on the shoulder calling for a spare. The 856 made its 9th pass on Terry Walsh's field at 3:22 p.m. Rick could see it from the road. He stood beside the truck with his hands on his hips and watched it. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a business decision about old iron and had been wrong about what old iron could do in the specific failure mode that arrived on June 14th. And he was standing on the side of the road watching the evidence of that miscalculation cross a rain-soaked field for the 9th time in the rain. He did not look away. He watched the whole pass. Then he watched the turn. Then he watched the next pass begin. At hour 19, he crossed the field. Harold idled down. They stood in the rain beside the tractor, and Rick said he hadn't known the node covered all 3 farms, and Harold said he had asked about it in 2019. And then Harold handed him the rebuild log. Rick took it. He was going to read it later, in his truck dry. What he read, standing in the field in the rain, was the first line of the first page. IH 856 rebuild log, H. Meeks, began November 2009, factory spec throughout. He looked at the tractor. He looked at the log. He handed it back up to Harold. Harold drove to the next windrow. He does not know, and would not particularly care, whether Rick Voss changed his opinion of old iron after June 14th. He knows that Dale Hoffman got his 400 acres baled. He knows that Karen Detweiler's photograph ran in August and that it showed the 856 running in the rain with 3 modern tractors dark in the background. He knows that the rebuild log is still on the nail by the shed door. He does not think of June 14th as a vindication. He thinks of it as a Tuesday in June, when his neighbors needed a tractor and he had one that ran. That is the whole of it for Harold. The 856 goes back under the top at season's end. The rebuild log stays on the nail. The parts cabinet on the second shelf has enough spares for another 10 years of operation, by Harold's estimate. The machine runs at factory specification. He does not expect it to fail. If someone is running something in your life that everyone else has written off, if there's a rebuilt thing, a proven thing, a thing whose record is clear even when nobody believes it, I want to hear about it in the comments. And if this story found you in the right moment, share it with whoever needs to hear it. Subscribe for the next one. It's coming soon. And it starts with a lease, a fire-safe box, and a woman who read a letter, set it down, and reached for a document she'd been keeping since 1998. There is something worth saying about what the farm journalist saw from the county road. Karen Detweiler had been covering Iowa agriculture for 11 years. She had seen a lot of machines in fields, a lot of farmers in cabs, a lot of conditions that would test anyone's patience. She had written about combines that failed during peak harvest, about irrigation systems that went offline in August heat, about weather events that came at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong season. She knew what a hard Tuesday in June looked like. She had not seen this before. She parked on the shoulder at 5:30 p.m. and stood at the road and watched the 856 make its 12th pass of the day. She had a camera. She raised it, framed the shot, and waited for the tractor to come toward her at the turn. When Harold made the turn, the headlights came on in the dusk. He always ran with headlights in low light, a habit from his plant years when visibility discipline was an operations requirement. And she got the photograph she wanted. 3 modern tractors in the background. Dark, not running, parked at the field entry where they had been since early morning. One 1969 International Harvester, Harvester Red, rebuilt to factory specification, headlights on, running its 13th pass. She wrote the caption standing at the car, notebook on the roof. She wrote several versions. She ended up with June 14th, only working machine on 3 Boone County farms, hour 22. She printed it in the August issue with a 2-paragraph note about the telematics failure, the weather event, and the rebuild. She called Harold for comment. He said, "Machine ran as expected." She asked if she could quote that. He said, "That's all there is to quote." She quoted it. Dale Hoffman read the article in August and drove to the co-op with it, folded under his arm. He had a tack in his pocket. He pinned it to the bulletin board without saying anything to anyone, went to the counter to pick up his supplies, and left. He did not make a speech about it. He just put it up because it was the true account of what had happened, and the bulletin board was where the true accounts of the county went. Rick Voss read it at the September meeting. He read it standing, the way you read something that takes a moment to absorb. He read it twice. He set the corner of the paper back against the board, which he had lifted slightly to read, and he smoothed it and did not comment. 3 other farmers at that meeting had been talking about the event since June. They did not talk about it in front of Rick. They talked about it in the parking lot after the meeting, with the kind of quiet specificity that rural communities use when talking about things that have been understood without needing to be said. One of them said, "Harold knew." Another said, "He told Rick in 2019 about the node." A third said, "Rick didn't listen." Then they went home because it was getting late and there was morning work. Harold was in the shed. He was running the post-season maintenance on the 856, the oil change, the filter, the hydraulic fluid check, the grease fittings, the bearing clearance check on the front axle. He had done this procedure every fall since 2012. It took half a day. He had a checklist on the wall next to the rebuild log. He finished at 3:45 p.m. He covered the 856 with the canvas top, not the original top. Calvin's top had rotted in 2019, but a new one. Same weight, same coverage. He closed the shed. He went inside. The machine had not failed. He did not expect it to. In the spring, a young farmer named Tyler Graves came to ask about the rebuild, and Harold showed him everything. And Tyler started the M on the first crank. And Harold said, "Tell Rick you saw it." He said it without heat, without score settling. He said it the way a man says something that is simply and clearly true, because the information was useful, and Rick Voss might benefit from having it. That is the kind of man Harold Meeks is. The 856 is in the shed. The rebuild log is on the nail. The parts cabinet is stocked. The machine runs at factory specification. Harold does not expect it to fail. There is something instructive in that kind of certainty. Not the arrogance of a man who has never been wrong, but the confidence of a man who did the work correctly and documented it and knows what he's dealing with. You build that certainty the slow way. 3 winters of insulated coveralls in an unheated shed. Every part to spec. Every fastener torqued. The log kept in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the weather. You build it the way the machine was built in 1969 by engineers who went into the field and watched things fail and built accordingly. And then, when the morning comes, the morning when 3 modules go dark at once and 400 acres of hay are on the ground, you start the engine and you go. The 856 started on the first crank at 7:09 a.m. on June 14th. It was the only working machine on 3 farms for 22 hours. Harold charged nothing. He did not expect anything in return. He was ready. He had been ready for a long time. Let's talk about what Calvin Meeks saw in 1971. The 856 was 2 years old. Calvin had it in the south, 40 on a morning in early November, pulling a chisel plow, the ground frozen at the surface but soft underneath the way Boone County ground gets in the weeks between the first hard freeze and the real winter. He made 3 passes, and then the right rear tire hit a pocket, a wet spot under the crust that he hadn't seen, and the tractor broke through to the mud and sank to the axle. He dug himself out with a spade and a set of traction boards he kept on the toolbox for exactly this. It took 40 minutes. He was muddy to the knee on both legs. He climbed back in the cab and sat for a moment, mud dripping off his boots onto the floor mat. And he looked at the field and the rut where the tire had gone in and the evidence of the recovery, and he thought, this machine just dug itself out of that. He ran 3 more passes that afternoon. The ground held. The 856 ran clean. That was the story he told Harold the year Harold came back to the farm. He told it the way men tell stories about machinery, not for the drama, but for the information. He said, that machine pulled itself out of a pocket in the south, 40 in 1971, and I ran 3 more passes after. That's what these engines do when they're right. He was 91 years old, and his memory was spotty about a lot of things. But it was clear as water about the 856 in the South 40 in November 1971. Harold listened. He went to the shed that afternoon and pulled the top off the 856 and looked at it. It was dusty. The red paint was faded at the hood corners. The cab window had a crack in the lower right that let in a thread of cold air when the wind was from the north. The engine was frozen. It would not turn over on the starter. The rings had galled to the cylinder walls over 30 years of sitting. He made his list. That was November 2017. He started the rebuild that same month, 2 weeks after his father told him about the South 40 in 1971. He worked until dark the first night, by work light, stripping the engine access panels and taking stock of what he had. He came back the next morning. He kept coming back. 3 winters. There's a thread that runs from Calvin Meeks in the South 40 in 1971 to Harold Meeks at the county road at hour 19 of June 14th, handing down the rebuild log in the rain. It is the thread of knowing your machine, not believing in it sentimentally, not trusting it on faith, knowing it, its specific tolerances, its specific failure modes, its specific strengths, the number you can ask of it, and the number you can't. Calvin knew the 856 that way. He taught Harold to know it that way. Harold rebuilt it on that basis and ran it on that basis and was ready on June 14th on that basis. Rick Voss had never known a machine that way. He knew a spec sheet. He knew a trade-in value. He knew a parts catalog and a service contract and a telematics dashboard. All of that was genuine knowledge. All of it was real. But it was not the knowledge you need when the node goes dark at 6:52 in the morning and 400 acres of hay are on the ground and the rain is coming down and someone needs a machine that runs without a signal. Harold had that knowledge. He had been building it since 1969. The photograph ran in August. The caption was slightly wrong about the hour count, but the photograph was exactly right. 1 machine running, 3 machines dark. The headlights of the 856 on in the dusk. Harold's silhouette in the cab. It is the picture of a thing built correctly and maintained correctly and run correctly by a man who knew what he had. That is the whole story. If it meant something to you, if you have that kind of knowledge about something in your life, or if you know someone who has it and hasn't been believed, leave a comment. Tell me what you know and how you know it. Hit the like button, subscribe so you get the next one, because the next story has a woman, a fire-safe box under a kitchen counter, a clause she asked for in 1998, and a conference room where everything changed on a Thursday morning in April